Okay, and so in this recording, we are going to now be going over lines 76 through 101. And remember, it is at this point in the story that we have already had the request made by Juno to Aeolus, the king of the winds, to employ those winds who he controls, that they be released upon Aeneas and his crew, wrecking the ships, killing the men, and essentially thwarting Aeneas in his journey. She has offered up to him a bribe of a bride, Deiopeia, and now we have the response that Aeolus is going to be giving to her. So, Aeolus, and there's a quotation, so it's going to be something along the lines of said, these things, haik, remember, is the neuter plural accusative, contra, against. Now, not against her, but like in response. Tuus is modifying labor, so your job, your labor, O queen, in the vocative, talking directly to her, is implied, so an est is missing here, but you can just supply it. It's what we call ellipsis. To explorare, to demand, to ask for, that's where we get the word explore. Quid optes, what you wish. Now this is an example of an indirect question. Direct questions we ask in English, are you hungry? When we turn that around and report that question indirectly, we switch the word order. Mr. Adams asks, if you are hungry. And so therefore, as an indirect question in English, we just change the word order. In Latin, what happens when the question is not being asked, but being reported, like what he says, your job, is to ask what you wish, this verb, and all verbs in indirect questions, turn into subjunctive. And we can see that this verb, optare, is a first conjugation, thus you have the present subjunctive, we fear a giant liar. So, your job is to ask what you want, what you opt for, what you desire, fas est. Now, fas is an indeclinable word that means divinely right or appropriate. The opposite of it is the word nefas, where we get the word nefarious. And so, it is a divinely right thing, and that's what fas means, to capesare, to carry out, to accomplish, and that's what the verb means, the orders, and it is divinely right for me. So essentially what he is telling to her is that our roles are that you ask and I do. So he continues on in the next few lines, in which he then goes on even furthermore to say, to, which of course is our subject, and there's your verb, concilio conciliare, which means to, as you can see here, we get the word reconcile, to make appropriate, to make good, and that you make appropriate, you make able, available, quodcumque, and this word means whatever, and it goes with hoc, so you make available whatever this thing, genitive of a kingdom. In other words, he's belittling in self-deprecation of his own position in his own kingdom. So whatever this thing is. It's kind of like a stereotype would be that a wife buys a brand new dress and she wears it and the husband sees, wow, where'd you get that from? He's like, oh, this little old thing, and that's the sort of kind of an attitude that he has here. So you make favorable whatever this of a kingdom for me. And then you see the anaphora with all of the twos. You make favorable the scepters. In other words, you are the one that puts me in this position of power. Que, and you make favorable Jupiter, Yoim, which remember is Jupiter in the nominative, but I-O-V is the stem for the remainder of the case expressions. He then continues on to say, you grant, you give, do, dari, deditatis, to me the ability implied to recline, cumbra, cumbere, at the banquets, epulis, from epula, epulai, of the gods. And again, this should be devorum, but we've now seen it several times, especially for the word for man and the word for gods, that very often the or will fall off. Que, and you make the facis of facia facere, the potentem, that's your accusative direct object, the power of the clouds and of the storms. Here, of course, orum, a second declension, genitive plural, and a third declension. Essentially what he has done here is that he has said in self-deprecation that you are the one that holds the real power. You are the ones that give me whatever I enjoy in a position of being the king, and so obviously whatever you ask of me, I'm going to do it. Haec ubi dicta. When these things having been said. Now very often what you can do in real Latin, Virgil, is that take that perfect passive participle that is nominative plural, neuter, and you can add a sunt to it, or any of the other helping verbs, to make it a finite verb to where it doesn't sound clunky when these things having been said. Instead it is when these things have been as a verb, or were said. Ablative absolute then. Cuspis cuspidus is a spear point. And that's why your teeth are sometimes referred to as the bicuspids. They have the one that have the 2 points on it. So with the spear point, conversa, having been turned, and this is describing an action of simply taking that spear that would usually have the point like this, having been turned upside down because he's about to whack the ocean. Put your mask on.
Yes, sir.
With the spear point, having been turned, he impulit, pello, pellere, pulli, which means to strike or to pelt. He struck the hollow mountain, kawum, where we get the word cave, into its side. This is accusative, and the way by which it is accusative you can see over here on the chart. In that, here in the neuter third declension, a word can happen to end with us as the variant, and therefore it's going to be again over here as the variant latus. So into its side did he strike the hollow mountain with his spear point having been turned, and the winds in your nominative, and this word velut. Ut, velut, sic ut are all these words that are going to be introducing similes. They essentially mean as. And here, a very frequent and prominent technique of using a simile to show the comparison of what is being going on and what it is similar to. So, and the winds, just like or as, and another ablative absolute. Agmen, agmenis is a battle line. Those winds, just like or as, with ablative, a battle line having been made, they ruant. Rua rure, they rush, and that's of course where we get the word. And they rush, qua porta data. Qua here with a long A very often is going to mean where. So they rush where the gate having been given. Again, what you can do is you can add a helping verb, just like we did with dicta, such that it'll make less clunky sense, and say, they rush where the gate data sunt was given, has been given, instead of being the perfect passive participle, et, and they blow through the lands in a whirlwind, turbo turbinus. And so essentially, as soon as they're let loose, it's kind of like popping a balloon and they rush out. And they obviously are going to wreak all sorts of havoc. Incubuere, and they sat upon, they did sit on the sea, que, and then we have them named. We talked about them earlier. And together, both Eurus and Notus and Africus, these are the winds, and Africus here is described with the word craber. It means frequent or frequented, and he is frequented por calis, ablative, it's the word for storm, one of them, and Africus, frequent with storms, because that is the direction from which the storms often come, like for us. We can count on, usually our bad weather, sweeping from the west, and that is the direction that they are usually going to be progressing. Nevertheless, all of these guys, Eurus and Notus and Africus, the one frequent with storms, they rush from their lowest seats, sedibus, sedes is seat, emis is an irregular form that is a superlative, it means lowest, and they rush the totem. It's just like the whole world. Do they do that? And they do it together. And they are obviously all combined in it together in somewhat And that's why it says, of course, all those winds that are named do it together. And they roll, wovere, wastos fluctus, huge, vast waves, again, that being an accusative plural, ad litora, towards the shores. And so what is being described here is the not only winds wreaking havoc probably on the sails of the ships, but causing the waters itself to become incredibly not just choppy, but ridden by storms, and obviously bad news, as we just now see. Que, and a shout of men. Once again, this should actually be orum, but due to syncopation, it is verum, genitive plural. A shout of men, and it's both the shout of men and the screeching. The English word strident means screeching, of ropes, and that's what a rudens rudentus is. Again, genitive plural. Those two things follow. Sequor, sequi, secutus sum. A deponent verb looks passive, translates actively. And suddenly, they rip the clouds and the sky and the day from the eyes of the Teucrians. Now, recently I've come across an interpretation by other Latin teachers in which I've always thought that the subject of eripiant was the understood winds, and they rip all that stuff. But it could also be that the clouds, instead of being the direct object, it could be the nominative, that the clouds do the ripping. And what they rip is the sky and the day from the eyes of the Teucrians, you know, and obviously it gets kind of dark in a storm preceding it, and that's what's going on here. And the nox atra, and black night sits upon, remember that means dark or black, and it sits upon, incubat, the sea, in the ablative. The poles, that being like North Pole, South Pole, in other words, directions of the sky, they intonuerade, they thundered. Very often, various gods have these different epithets for the different roles. For example, Mars is sometimes in the character or manifestation of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. Whereas here, when you have the thundering, that would be, of course, Jupiter, and Jupiter is sometimes known as Tonans, which is the thundering Jupiter. And so here the word tonuere means to thunder. The poles thundered, and the aether, meaning the air. It used to be, before we understood the nature of light, that we thought that light passed through outer space, or space in general, through a particular medium that was made up called the luminiferous ether. But there was a science experiment called Michelson-Morley that disproved that that existed, and that light was, of course, universal, regardless of the reference frame. Nevertheless, and the air, the ether, flashes, mikat, and that's where we get the type of rock called mica that has all the little capabilities of reflecting light. For example, here is a piece of granite, and I don't know if you can barely make it out, but there are little bitty pieces of mica, and thus it would obviously flash, as you can see. Nevertheless, the ether flashes, present tense. Again, that same word we saw previously, crever, again, creveris means frequent, with frequent fires. And the flashing of these fires is going to be the obvious thunder and lightning that comes along with it. Cle, and all things, intentat, indicate immediate death, present death, mortem, for the men. It is obviously a situation that is most dire. Every indication, every element of their surroundings indicates to them that they are not long for this world. And at the first time, we finally meet the man by name. Up to this point, he's always been the guy, the man. Arma verumque, unnamed, that guy, ille. For the first time, we now see him by name. And also, he becomes a character within the story of the action. And this is not how, ordinarily, we would expect to see the great hero. For he is presented at the very outset, when we meet him, as being in fear. And that's what we have. The membra, the members, the limbs of Aeneas, immediately, extemplo, are loosened, solveo solvere, and they are loosened by the cold, as in fear. He groans, gamuit, or gamit, present tense. And tendanes, tendo, tendere, stretch out. And stretching, present active participle, his dupliques, his double palms, to the stars, sidus sideris. This word is one of the two famous or common Latin words, sideris, for a star, and it is where we get the word sidereal, which is the English word meaning related to the stars. There are two ways by which we can measure a day. There's a solar day and a sidereal day. Solar day, we measure by the sun and its activities, and then sidereal day, the stars. The other, of course, is the word in Latin, astra. So astra and sidus. This obviously is sidera as the neuter plural. So again, it is our guy, Aeneas. He, the one stretching, present active participle, his double palms to the stars in a position of praying or begging for some sort of assistance from the divine powers of the sky. He refert. Now, remember from the verb, fero, fere, tuli, latus, that it is to bring or to carry, but very often in the Aeneid, it is going to mean to say. And so he says, and you can just ignore for the most part the re on the front. Very often these prefixes merely intensify what the verb actually means. And so he says, or if you would like, he says back, such things, again, neuter, plural, talia. Both talia and sidera are third declension, neuter, plural, accusative, so they end in a with his voice. Now, a particular point is that very often students will make the horrible mistake of thinking he speaks, he says, with such a voice. Talia cannot modify woke. Talia, on the other hand, if it were to modify woke, would have to be talis, or tali, I should say. The reason being is, let me go ahead and put that there, and bring this over so you can easily see it, is that it is talis, talis, tale, and thus if it were modifying woke, which is feminine, it would be tali, that you can see there. And so it is obviously not going to be the form such a voice, but instead such things, neuter plural, with his voice, as it were. O terque quaterque beati. O both and 3 times, which is what ter means. Remember this bis is twice. And 4 times blessed. Beati means lucky, happy, or more importantly, blessed. For example, the famous passage of the Sermon on the Mount are the Beatitudes, in which these are the blessing. And of course, famously, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, and so forth and so on. So, 3 and 4 times blessed, they are implied, a sunt. Now, that word is an archaic form. It is really quibus. But instead, it contracted to a form that had previously been, which is quis. And so it is really dative plural. And it is dative of reference. For whom, and then we're going and finding our verb, and there it is. Now, contigit is a verb that has a peculiar idiomatic expression. And it is for whom it is befitting. For whom it is appropriate, allowed, any of those sorts of things. So for whom it is allowed, opetere, means essentially to die in this context. And so here it is the root of it, peto, petere, to seek, but as in to seek the end. For whom it is allowed to die, ante ora, in front of the faiths, and remember that ora comes from os, oris, which means mouth, but when it is in the plural, and it is neuter, it is going to be essentially the whole of the face. Another example of synecdoche, one part of something representing the whole. In front of the faces of the genitive fathers under the high walls of Troy. And so the first time that we meet Aeneas, he's essentially regretting the fact that he didn't die in battle. An example, or a parallel of this, would be the movie Forrest Gump, if you've ever seen it. Lieutenant Dan wakes up in a hospital and he's angry. He's angry because he wanted that glorious death in battle if he is going to obviously suffer at all. And so here you have Aeneas, the same sort of thing. He doesn't want to go out like this. He doesn't want to drown on his way, obviously, the journey post the battle. He's a warrior. And so if he is to have to die, he wants in the glory of war, even though in many ways war has no glory whatsoever. And then he continues on. Oh, And he's talking to fortissime tidide, which of course is in the vocative. Tidide has a particular form to it, and that is, if you have ides or idus attached to a person's name, it is what we call a patronymic. A patronymic is a naming system whereby you are so called in terms of your father's name. And so my father's name is Dale, so therefore I would be Daledes, meaning the son of Dale. Or you can take your father's name, add edes to it, and all of a sudden you have your name in the form of the patronymic. And so that's just, my father would be Elmerides, because his father was named Elmer, and so forth and so on. And so the son of Tydeus is actually the great Greek warrior Diomedes. And so he is addressing Diomedes. Now the reason why this is done at this particular time is that near to the beginning of the Iliad, when the action first starts in the fighting, that Diomedes is going to lead the Greek charge in attacking the Trojans in what is called an Aristeia, in which he is assisted by the goddess Minerva, or in the Iliad, Athena, as to which he is referred. And he even fights against the god, both Mars, and he fights, being assisted by Athena, of course, against Aphrodite. And the situation with Aphrodite is such, he strikes down Aeneas on the battlefield, and is about to ultimately strike him down, and his mother, Aeneas' mother, Venus, or in the Iliad again, Aphrodite, comes down to try and save him, and Diomedes even attacks her, and does so successfully. She runs away, and to where he is eventually rescued by another god in the intervention. But in addressing him, he is recalling that singular moment that was truly almost his end. Oh, most brave son of Tydeus, most brave of the race of the Greeks. And so he's referring to him as the bravest that the Greeks had to offer. Again, what we then have is what we have seen before. Is may, the accusative, and this is an accusative of exclamation. And it will then, if it is as an accusative functioning like a subject, and here you can see that exclamation, then it is going to obviously have an infinitive as the verb. And there you have it with non potuisse. And since it is a perfect infinitive, let's express it perfect. Oh, was I not? And again, nay is merely an enclitic, indicating a kind of an exclamation question, or sort of a rhetorical question. Oh, was I not able, oh, have I not been able to recline in the Trojan fields? That's another way of saying lie there dead. Campus aum. The word campus means field, like the famous Campus Martius in ancient Rome is the field of Mars, where originally they had all kinds of training that went on and military exercises. Later becomes a place where they do all of their voting. But nevertheless, oh, was I not able, or have I not been able to lie in the Trojan fields, and to pour out, fundo fundere furifusus, with an EX on the front, due to assimilation, however, it turns to EF, to pour out this spirit. Please be sure that you know the difference between, hopefully the camera will be able to catch this, but animus is your mind or your heart, whereas your anima is your spirit. Second declension versus first declension. It is like the breath of life and the soul that you have. And to pour out this soul, this breath of life, by, with, because of, from, in, on, at your right hand. Remember, he's talking directly to Diomedes and exclaiming that he wished that Diomedes had been the one to strike him down, because that would have been a glorious death, unlike, obviously, drowning in the ocean in the middle of a storm. Nevertheless, he then goes on to say, to pour out this life by your right hand, where Saevus Hector, where savage Hector lies. Now, yaket, as you can see with the E, tells me that it is the verb yakeo, yakere, a second conjugation, and thus not the verb to throw, which would be yakeo, yakere. If it were the verb to throw, it would be yakit, with an I. But because it is an E, it tells me second conjugation. Where savage Hector lies, indicating Hector did die in the war, and that is then the place at which his body was lying in the field. Where he lies, by, with, because of, from, in, on, at, the weapon, telum, teli, of Iacadus, or Iacades, which here It's the son of Aeacus, or the grandson of Aeacus, and it's Achilles. And it's indicating that Hector's death. Ubi ingain Sarpedon, where huge Sarpedon lies. Another famous death of the Iliad. Sarpedon was the son of Zeus that when he faced off against Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, who was wearing Achilles' armor and fighting in Achilles' stead, while Achilles had withdrawn from the war because of his anger at the rest of the Greeks for insulting him at the very beginning of the Iliad. He, of course, Patroclus, strikes down Sarpedon, and Sarpedon is almost rescued by intervening of Zeus, until finally Hera said, you cannot do it. You cannot step in and alter fate in this way, even though you are a god. And so it is an incredibly famous scene in which Zeus has to see his son struck down in battle before him. So where huge Sarpedon dies, and where, and this is a particular river, the Simois River, which is right near Troy. And where the Simois River, and you got to find your verb, and there it is. We've now seen this verb several times. Wo, re, where the river rolls. Tote, so many correpta scuta. So many shields, that is scutum scuti, modified by correpta. So many shields snatched, having been grabbed, perfect passive participle, under its waves. And they are the shields of men. Again, the usage of the syncope to be wear room instead of wear warm. We've seen this time and time again. And also, where the Simois River rolls, and also rolls, the galeas, the helmets, implied of men, and where the Simois River rolls, the strong bodies. So it's describing this river that is littered after the battle with all kinds of the equipment that's worn by the soldiers, their shields, their helmets, but also the bodies themselves in that river. And he wants to be a part of that instead of dying in a storm. Instead, he wants for himself the glorious battle. So, really quickly, the first time we meet Aeneas, I would not say that necessarily he's acting truly heroic. He is in some ways acting somewhat like a spoiled brat, in that he's complaining that he can't die in the way that he sees fit. And also, when we first met him, he was scared, in that it said his limbs were loosened by the cold. And not exactly a bold first foray, but he will soon recover, and we will see his true nature of being a leader. And so maybe in some ways, what this does is when we first meet Aeneas, it humanizes him. It makes him an ordinary human, and not this above-board heroic figure that will, in any situation, have such bravery and such high value. He can be petty sometimes, I suppose, like we all can. And he can be scared sometimes, like I suppose, like he all can. But moving forward, within a few lines, when they finally make landfall, we'll see the true nature of his leadership and the true nature of his heroism shown forth. So, hope you study. Now we've gone through lines 101 and put in the time.